Thank you, Jerry, for that kind introduction. It is a real pleasure to be here, although this is a tough act to follow. I hope I can live up to what the wonderful program that she has already laid out for us tonight. The minute he said something about history, I saw a few heads go, oh, they were like, oh my God, what is he going to talk about? Well, it's a real honor to speak at the graduation ceremony for the GALEO Institute of Leadership class of 2015. Each of you who is participating in this ceremony tonight will soon join over 400 community leaders from across the state who have graduated from this program and who are now working to make Georgia a better place. And let me tell you, Larry, you had no reason to be nervous. You did a fabulous job. I think you've got some future employees out here too. Incredible passion here. And if you can grow a foot by being in this, participating in this, I think I'd like to become a member of the next class of GALEO. But I want to thank GALEO for inviting me tonight to speak here. GALEO, from what I have seen and what I have read, and particularly what I've seen tonight, it's an amazing organization. Under the leadership of Jerry Gonzalez and your very dedicated board, GALEO has created and amassed a remarkable track record of supporting the Latino community, of raising awareness of issues confronting Latinos, of encouraging Latino participation in the civic life of this state, and of developing leaders that are committed not just to the Latino community, but also committed to solving problems for all Georgians, especially in the area of immigration, which is a subject that affects all of us in this state. So thank you for all that you do for our state and for the people of the state. The GALEO was founded in 2013 during a very unique time in our state's history. And understanding history, that is our collective story of who we are as Georgians, both older and new Georgians, is crucial to making sense out of the present and building the kind of future that we all want for our state. When we understand our past, when we understand how the world came to be today and how it was created, and armed with that knowledge of understanding how the world was created, we can go forward and make better decisions and create a better future. How we understand the past. Everybody has a sense of what happened in the past. Sometimes that's based on real documentary evidence, sometimes it's based on folklore and myth. But how we see and understand the past shapes how we see the present. And it shapes the kinds of decisions that we make every day. And the Georgia Historical Society, which I have the honor of leading, encourages people to stand on new ground and to see the past in a different way. You can take the example of immigration. If we understand the story of immigration in the United States, if we understand that this is a nation of immigrants, that we all came at some time from some other place to this country, if we understand how every successive wave of immigration has been looked at by the people who are already here, it's the same story over and over and over again. And if we can understand that what we are confronted with today is not anything new, but it is an ongoing struggle about how to define who we are as Americans, then we can look at immigration in an entirely new way. Now, what I'd like to do tonight is to take us on a very quick journey through the last half century or so as a way of explaining. Sounds like my microphone's gone out. Did it go out? Hello, can you hear me out there? All right, I'm going to shout. Through the last half century or so as a way of explaining the Georgia that we live in today, and as a way of helping us to think about the kind of Georgia that we are going to bequeath to our children into the future. Well, the decade of the 1980s marked the beginning of perhaps the most explosive growth in the history of Georgia. By every measure, job creation, businesses attracted and businesses created, infrastructure built, urban and suburban expansion, population growth, and an expanding housing market The past 30 years have been the most successful ever enjoyed by this state. Although the Great Recession of the late 2000s slowed the pace of growth and persistent poverty and crime continued to detract from it, there's no denying the miraculous transformation of Georgia from an agricultural, segregationist, one-party state to a vibrant, diversified, and dynamic economic engine of the New South. Well, if the decade of the 1980s launched the unparalleled growth and expansion that we enjoy today, then it's also true that the momentous events of the 30 years prior to 1985 set the stage for that growth. The period of social upheaval and revolutionary change that spanned the period from 1955 to 1985 was unlike anything seen in this state since 1865 and the end of slavery. Beginning with a U.S. Supreme Court decision in 1954, and eventually with legislation aimed at voting and civil rights in the 1960s, the federal government responded to the demands of African Americans for full citizenship that had been denied them for nearly a century. As a consequence, white and black leaders in Atlanta, Savannah, and other states or other cities across the state began to work together. Now, they did this sometimes willingly, sometimes by force of law, but they began to work to dismantle a system of racial oppression. They desegregated lunch counters, public facilities, and public schools. They repealed poll taxes and literacy tests that had prevented African Americans from voting and registered thousands of new black voters. By the early 1970s, the collapse of Jim Crow was so complete that African Americans were elected for the very first time since Reconstruction to local, state, and national offices. It's impossible to overestimate the impact of the civil rights movement on the economic and social health of Georgia, as it destroyed a system that prevented a third of the state's population from participating in the political process. The civil rights movement freed Georgia from its ancient obsession with race and maintaining white supremacy. The extraordinary energy and resources that for decades had been expended, indeed had been squandered, to keep African Americans from enjoying full political and legal rights could now be used to unleash latent economic potential. The dire prediction by segregationists that African American equality would lead to the apocalypse never materialized, and leaders of both races could now focus on creating an economy that was powerful enough to catapult the state into the modern era. Now, most of us, many of us anyway, have heard the story about how Atlanta and Birmingham were basically in the same place in 1960, and how Atlanta overtook Birmingham and in the process became the dominant city in the region. As the story goes, in 1960, both cities, Birmingham, Atlanta, were roughly the same size. Both were poised to emerge as the economic leader of the New South. The difference was leadership, the order of priorities, and opposing visions of what the future would look like. Alabama was led by reactionaries like Governor George Wallace and Birmingham Public Safety Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor, who tried to stop segregation by defying federal law and courts. They thought that the future could be built upon white supremacy, and that the world would continue to be a better place if the races were separated. The future that these people envisioned was firmly tied to the worst impulses of the past, regardless of the economic consequences. On the other hand, Georgia was led by strong leaders like Governor Carl Sanders and Atlanta Mayor Ivan Allen, business executive Robert W. Woodruff, who refused to pander to the worst instincts of the electorate, and they either worked to dismantle Jim Crow or they at least peacefully accepted its demise. The future that they envisioned was one of economic prosperity, and they were willing to cast aside the hallowed custom of segregation if it stood in the way of achieving this goal. In the decade following the Civil Rights Movement, as African Americans began to win political office during the 1970s, new leaders with an eye to the future began to emerge. Building on the first attempt at racial cooperation during the 1960s, Atlanta's white businessmen and black politicians seized the opportunity created by the civil rights movement to reinvent the state. Freed from the icy grip of the past, to use a phrase that was coined by Thomas Jefferson, they envisioned something that Georgia had never had, a truly biracial society forged on the anvil of economic growth and shared political power. Leaders like Tom Cousins and Andrew Young, Maynard Jackson and John Portman, Herman Russell, Robbie W. Woodruff, Ted Turner and Jesse Hill found common ground and united around a common goal, a better, economically strong Georgia. Now, this coalition created the World Congress Center, which is not far from us. They built MARTA, and they upgraded the Hartsfield-Atlanta International Airport, setting the stage for the explosive economic growth that would happen during the 1980s. Because of the right leadership, priorities, and vision, Atlanta's fortunes rose while that of Birmingham sank. Businesses began to flee from Birmingham or to avoid it altogether, while Atlanta became a magnet for business. Eventually, Atlanta would eclipse its Alabama rival and every other southern city that had clung to a segregated past. Today, the city of Atlanta has a GDP larger than 33 states. Atlanta ranks 4th nationally in the number of Fortune 500 companies, only behind New York, Houston, and Dallas. It is home to 7 Fortune 100 companies, 16 Fortune 500 companies. If you include Columbus in that, then Georgia has 20 Fortune 500 companies headquartered in the state. Alabama has 1. Now let's take a moment just to reflect on a few of the events and the people from the last 30 years that shape this world that we live in today and that represent what Georgia has become. Perhaps the most important is the creation of the Georgia Lottery by Governor Zell Miller, the 1995 World Series victory for the Atlanta Braves, the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, the impact of Home Depot founders Arthur Blank and Bernie Marcus, the aquarium right over here that he built, the purchase of the Falcons, the rise of Leah Ward Sears as the first African-American woman Chief Justice of any state Supreme Court, the G8 Summit that took place at Sea Island, Roy Barnes and the creation of the new state flag, the confirmation of Justice Robert Benham and Clarence Thomas, the 1988 Democratic National Convention in Atlanta, and the artistic contributions of rock band REM and of Atlanta Symphony conductor Robert Shaw. Now, from the perspective and the vantage point of 2015, the success and the progress that I've described of the last 30 years, well, it just seems inevitable, as if the story was fated to turn out the way that it did. We take it for granted that Georgia would emerge as a leader, that it would become the 8th most populous state in the Union, and that Atlanta, with its international airport and its sports franchises, would become the capital of the post-Jim Crow South. We assume that Coca-Cola and CNN and Home Depot and Delta and Chick-fil-A and SunTrust and Aflac and Georgia Power and Georgia Pacific and a host of other corporate giants would emerge and they would prosper beyond all imagination. And that companies like Home Depot, Cox Communications, UPS, NCR, Gulfstream, Mercedes-Benz would relocate to Georgia just because this is naturally a great place to do business. But the reality is that's not how it happened. There was nothing inevitable about Georgia's growth. It was never a foregone conclusion that we would become who and what we are today. At every turn, the fate of our state hinged on the decisions, good and bad, made by our leaders, both political and business. Fortunately for Georgia, our predecessors made good choices. They weren't perfect, and there are still enormous, complex, and vexing issues, especially about race and poverty, that we have yet to resolve. But in general, the Georgia that we live in today is a testament to the caliber of past leadership and the power of wise decisions, proper priorities, visionary planning, and openness to change. What about Alabama? Well, as for Alabama, it's still living with the ripple effects of the decisions made over half a century ago. many of which played out on national television, and they shaped the image that America had of that state. It's still dealing with Bull Connor's decision in 1963 to turn fire hoses on demonstrators, with George Wallace's decision that same year to block the doorway of change at the University of Alabama and to declare that segregation would last forever. It's still dealing with the legacy of the March on Selma and a church bombing that killed 4 little girls. Over the past few years, Alabama has made great strides. It's worked to overcome its past. It's slowly recovering and attracting business. Birmingham is making a big comeback, but the damage that was done by poor decisions and missed opportunities so long ago has been very slow to heal and very hard to repair. Well, today, Georgia stands at a crossroads. The next 30 years will test our resolve to keep moving forward and our ability to make good decisions. The challenge to remain competitive in a global economy is great, but so is overcoming segregation and forging the first biracial alliance for progress. If history teaches us anything, it teaches us that nothing is inevitable, that each step is uncertain and filled with chance, that the effects of our decisions last for decades, and that it is leaders with the right vision and priorities that determine the outcome of a crisis or if an opportunity is seized or missed. I want you to understand that Alabama had a vision. It's not like they didn't have a vision. They had a vision, but that was a very different vision of what the future would look like than the leaders of Georgia. As it did in 1955 and again in 1985, 2015, meeting the challenges of today will take a commitment to the common good, an emphasis on what unites us rather than divides us, and a willingness, as Abraham Lincoln put it, to disenthrall ourselves of the past. It will require us to think strategically and carefully about the consequences, both intended and unintended, of the legislation we pass, realizing that the easiest solution may not be in the long-term best interest of all Georgians. We need to remember that we're no longer competing with Alabama. Now we're competing with New York and Tokyo and Beijing, and the stakes are higher than ever before. We need to live up to our rhetoric about tolerance, to keep the promise that we have made about liberty and education and economic opportunity, and be willing to think anew, or at least accept anew, even when whatever is new goes against what we've always believed. We need to be willing once again to reinvent ourselves or face falling behind in the race. The decisions we make now and in the future will be the legacy that we will leave to our children and our grandchildren. Just as we live today in the world that those who came before us created, succeeding generations will live in the world that we shape for them. What will they say 30 years hence about how we met challenges and dealt with crisis or took advantage of opportunity? Well, the next chapter in our state's history, the one that we are currently writing, will it be marked by growth or marked by decline? Can we afford to become complacent, to assume that our success is inevitable, to cede leadership to those whose priorities and vision for the future are inconsistent with economic prosperity? Historian David Hackett Fisher has written that, quote, "The history of a free people is the history of hard choices." In other words, our destiny is in our own hands. What will be the verdict of the future on the decisions that we will make? Will we be praised or condemned for the way we handle issues involving race, sexual orientation, Confederate and segregationist era symbols, poverty, crime, infrastructure, transportation, education, immigration, and the environment? Will we be compared to George Wallace and Bull Connor, or instead to Zell Miller and Andrew Young and Arthur Blank and Billy Payne and Tom Cousins and Martin Luther King Jr.? My challenge to each of you tonight as you graduate is this: to live with a sense of your own place in history. I know some of you are quite young, and that's hard to do, but I can assure you that eventually you'll be old like I am, and you'll start thinking about your legacy. But live every day realizing that you are creating a legacy. Live with a sense of your own history. The best gift that we can give to the future is to remember that nothing is inevitable and that the decisions that we make today will echo through throughout time.